Hey everybody, so I am back. What I have done is I took the latex caulking and I applied that liberally across this whole piece of terrain. And then I took regular sand and just covered it all over the place, and then took a latex glove and I just used my hand and just lightly patted all of the sand into the latex caulking before it dried. I let that actually sit for probably 36 hours, and then I took PVA glue, watered down 1:1 with water, which is still actually pretty thick. It might even have been 1/3 and 2/3 water, and I had to use a cleaned out Windex spray nozzle because my normal Scenic Cement spray nozzle was getting clogged really quick. But I coated this thing so it had like a sheeny white milky sort of covering over the whole thing, and let that dry for 24 hours. I also had a little heater going on in the room just to keep it nice and toasty in the room. I'm doing other things for later in preparation that I'll talk about later, but I was making foam as well, the foam foliage, and so I had a number of things that needed to dry, and so I'll talk about that in a later stage. But yeah, actually, if you look at it here, it's on there actually pretty tight, and it's only, I think it's because I actually just really coated this thing with PVA and PVA water mixture. So next up is I'm actually going to make and sculpt the trees. Now, I thought about just doing them all one way, but the Architects of War, their article shows how to do this for a much smaller scale, in which case they just use nails, actual nails, and they just paint the nail, and because it's such a small scale that there was no sculpting involved. Because this is 28mm, I wanted to do some sculpting and making it look like trees, but I also wanted to create a little bit of diversity, and so some of them I'm not actually going to put the sculpting material on. I'm going to make them like a birch, because birch have a tendency to be fairly uniform looking, round, and so I'm going to do some birch, but then I'm also going to do some that are sculpted up as to having ridges and some character to them. I've never used this before, but I thought this might be a good product, and I have looked a little bit online. People have used it before, but I'm just going to use a spackling, like a polyfilla, and then just try to sculpt some lines into it as I'm going along. So that will be the next stage, and I'll come back when I'm finished. Hey everybody, so I am back, and I've applied the polyfilla to the trees. So it was interesting. I used latex gloves and just applied it with my fingertips. I've never used this stuff before, and it comes out quite a bit. When you pull it out, it's almost like, I was thinking of cottage cheese. I mean, it doesn't look like cottage cheese there, but when you actually pull it out and work it, it kind of does almost. It has a kind of really gooey, lumpy consistency. Initially, I was a little concerned because I wasn't sure, and what I did, because it's really wet, and I think part of that is to keep it from drying, and so you can have your container and use it for a while. I'd put it on here, and I just worked it. I have a bit of a heater going in the room right now anyway, and I just worked it on with my spatula, and very quickly, just working it out on the spatula, it just quickly kind of gets a nice workable consistency. And then with my fingers, I essentially just put it on. Now, initially, I was looking at sculpting this, where I was going to do lines kind of going up, and that was kind of the idea, kind of like with a clay. But when I saw this and the way it was applied, I immediately kind of recognized that there's a bit of an old world sort of lumpy, gnarly tree that you can very easily get just by using your fingers with a latex glove and just patting it on. It kind of likes to grip to the glove a little bit, but mostly sticks. But by doing that, you're kind of creating all kinds of knots and things on there. And in one spot, I was even able to make a little bit of like a dead tree trunk in there. So what I'm thinking of doing, I actually like this look even more. I'm still sticking with the idea of doing some birch, and so I think I have 7 trees out of 20 something that are birch. Not a whole lot, but enough to create a little bit of a diversity in the look. But I did get some on the terrain here. Now, this is unpainted yet, and so it didn't really matter as far as the color. But what I was able to do is just take a broad, nice brush, not a nice brush, but just like a stiff brush. Just actually, it was a cheap one that I gotten over at Walmart, and just with some water. And you can very easily just wash that away so you keep your sand texture, the spots that you don't want to clump up. But I just wanted to show you this, because this is the stuff essentially I use, this polyfilla, and so far it's really looking good. I am planning on potentially running a piece of light sandpaper over just a couple of spots just to take some sharp edges off, but overall I really like, at least as it's wet, this lumpy sort of treed look that I'm getting, and so I'm actually going to probably stick with that. That's a bit of a change of plan, but I'll actually go with it because I just kind of like the way it's looking. So after this stuff dries, I'll come back with the next step. Hey everybody, so I've actually done a lot since the last clip. Just to give you an update, in the last clip I had the polyfilla on, and everything was really textured but unpainted. And so what I had done is I then sprayed the whole thing black with just regular black spray paint, nothing special. It wasn't a primer, it was a paint. And so when the entire thing was then painted, my next step was to start dry brushing the ground. And I'm not really going to go over what dry brushing is, but it just quickly to tell you, it's just getting like a decent sized brush and just putting some paint on the brush, but then wiping it off on a paper towel so the bristles are covered with the paint, but not wet, not overly wet, so it's not going to streak. It's just going to lightly cover textures when you brush over them. And so what I used was, I'm using Craft Smart paints for everything. I'll just show you. These are all the paints that I'm using on the texture here. And so this case, I just grabbed a dark brown. This one's called Cocoa Bean. It doesn't really matter. I think just go for generally what you're looking for, what paint you have, or if you're going to buy stuff, it's just, I always, black and white, we're going to need lots of. I'll show you that later. But I just go for just a dark brown initially. And so that's going to be the longest step as far as the dry brushing. This has been then also gone over with a little bit of tan, which I do recommend. Tan as a color, just to lightly go over. But as you'll see here real close, you can see the dark brown below and then the tan above, essentially. And so yeah, and black is nice because it does give you just sort of a bit of a dark tone undercoat to be working with. And so once I was finished with that, I then mixed my own dark gray for these tree trunks. And essentially I just used primarily black acrylic paint. This is just gotten at Michael's, and then I just kept adding white until I liked it, which is very little to keep it dark. And I didn't dry brush, but I tried not to glop too much paint because I didn't want to get it on the ground. But I basically, just I used more of a stippling method. I used a brush that you would use sort of like for dry brushing, but with a long bristle, and just kind of stippled by poking at it just to get it into all of the crevices, and then painted wherever it was smooth, like the top and just smooth parts of the trunk, and then went down to the base. And then I still have to dry brush this with a lighter gray, and so to bring out some details, I'm actually not going to go too light on it. I'm just going to get a lighter gray on it, but but still somewhat of a dark gray. And then I then painted some birch tree effects on the, so I painted I didn't go pure white. It might look pure white just on this board, but I added a little bit of black and to get it a little darker. And then I used a wooden toothpick with black paint, and I just went through and made dots and little scratches and lines and little spots where the tree has more of the paper birch bark coming off. And then when finished with that, and I'll let you know, I mean, initially it was just starting to look like a Dalmatian, like white polka dots, and I was like, this isn't, I'm not so sure, you know, whether this is what I want or not. And granted, this is going to be under the canopy, so it's not going to be like a focus shot like we're looking at. But then I decided to make these bigger spots of imperfections, and the formula I came up with is in every facing that I look at on a tree, north, south, east, or west, I want to see a couple of bigger spots where the bark is coming off. And so when I turn this way, you can see there's a spot everywhere like that. And I find that little bit of variation was enough for me to really like the way it was starting to look. I also, you could use any sort of wash, you could make your own, but I had some flesh wash that I just tested on a palette to look at. I wanted a bit of a browny orange thin wash to create some, my wife told me the name of what goes on birch. It's like a fungus that has that brown look. I just call it weathering. I know that's not the right term, but I wanted a little bit of that look you get sometimes on birch that has the changing of the browns that come, like, I guess it's a fungus. But I notice it's often at the base and then sometimes just in certain spots. So I selectively put that in some spots, but I did put it on most of the base of the birch. And I really do think that kind of brings out the piece a little bit more too. You know, considering these are just plain wooden dowels with very little texture at all on them, because I wanted it to be a kind of a smooth birch, I'm really happy with the way that looks. Yeah, so that's just an update on you know, or I should say, since this is a tutorial, that's just the next stage. I do have to do a bit of dry brushing in there. You'll see that on the next video that I'll have completed that. I'm really close to where I want to be, because the next part for the base piece is just to put some foliage down, and I've not made the foliage that I'm using. That's going to be primarily for the canopy. And so I will be putting some extra ground effects on this, but I'd say the big work for the canopy floor is complete, and I'll be moving on to the canopy next. Okay?